because we have people. Yeah, people have to have grandparent duties at short notice and so on who'll be interested, I'm sure. So
yeah.
And of course, Pentridge, I think now with its redevelopment has a high-end film theatre, I think. A cinema.
Yes, I think it does. Yeah,
what goes around comes around.
That's right. Yeah, no, it was a pretty horrific place when I was there, I must say. Still, it was just a Victorian era jail, bluestone, tiny little cells, and yeah, it was just shocking. In fact, they also had Jica there, which was a new modern prison, and eventually had to close that down because it was even worse than the Victorian one. So
yeah, no, Pentridge, quite an imposing presence.
yeah,
in COVID.
totally, yeah.
And so essentially, were you doing consulting, contracting work rather than working?
Yeah, just hunting around for films that came up, and in those days there was a relatively strong kind of government film area, which had started off as something that all the government departments or the public service had their own film, like the Commonwealth Film Unit. They would have a film unit to make their own sort of films, PR films, and so on. And at the time I came into the industry, that had just started to be outsourced. So Film Victoria, as it was then, would try and find private companies to make these films and would then sort of tender them out to be made. So I was doing that sort of thing for a while. And then I went back up to Sydney to live, and I worked for Film Australia there down at when it was in Linfield back in the late 80s.
So in 1987 with Sue Maslin, you found your own company.
We did. Well, it's an interesting story. Sue, the three people who've been working together, well, it was really four with Jenny Hocking, but me, Sue Maslin, and Ian Wansborough have been working on a whole series of films together way back since Sue and Ian and I attended in Canberra that course at the CEA. So we met there, and we've continued working together ever since, really. But there was a period straight after that course, so from 1983, when Sue was off doing her own thing, and we only really got back together again in 1990, about 90, when we made our first film together, which was Mr. Neil is Entitled to Be an Agitator, about Lionel Murphy, the High Court judge and Attorney General in the Whitlam government.
And sort of, I suppose, you've been very followed documentaries rather than, say, story cinema. If
yes,
not a good description, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Why the interest in documentaries?
Look, I just had that as a solid interest, and I actually started off, our first film I ever made was at Swinburne, and that actually got nominated for Best Experimental at the AFI Awards, then what they'll call the AFI, now Actors. And it was a combination of documentary and drama, a mixture. And I was really interested in that idea of what's the difference between drama and documentary, and how can you put them together. And it was perfect subject matter. It was a film about Frank Hardy, the Australian author, but he had written many of his books, including Power Without Glory, his most famous book, under a pseudonym, Ross Franklin, which was a combination of his name and his wife's name, Rosalind Hardy and Frank Hardy, and he made Ross Franklin. And he thought of Ross Franklin as a sort of fictional character who he then wrote about in other books, including a book called Who Shot George Kirkland. And so he had this fictional character, which was really his alter ego, but he could play with that idea of this Ross Franklin character. And so I made this documentary that was a biography of Ross Franklin, but Frank Hardy starred in it, and he told us all about his great friend, Ross Franklin.
Okay.
And that was the perfect way to make that film, or to make a story about Frank Hardy, because that was absolutely what he was doing in his own literary practice. So it was reflected really well on the screen. And then I went on to make a longer feature film, which again had film dramatic elements in it, and documentary elements, and sort of merged the two. That was based on Jenny's PhD thesis, which was on the development of Australia's counter-terrorism networks. So there was a lot of possibility for sort of drama in relation to various things to do with terrorists and reconstructing, exercises that counter-terrorist police do and that sort of thing. And that was all very new in Australia then. And we didn't even have any specific terrorism laws then. The government had commissioned Justice Windayer, who was on the High Court way back in the early 70s, to say, should we have specific laws about terrorism? And he came back and said, no, we should just use the criminal law. If the law is broken, if there's murders or conspiracies or whatever, or planning, then all of that's covered by the criminal law. So it wasn't until much later that we actually developed the specific terrorism laws, which were much more based on the British situation with the IRA and all that sort of stuff. So that film was, again, a combination of sort of fictional and documentary elements. And the interesting thing about that is the ideas that I had for doing that kind of got a bit derailed by people who made mockumentaries. They took over, so that the way people thought about involving documentary with drama suddenly became this one possibility, which was to make mockumentaries. And so there was a lot of those that came out around the same time as I was doing my work, and that sort of put me off a bit because I don't really like mockumentaries. I mean, some of them are extremely funny, like Spinal Tap, something like that.
Unbelievably funny.
Yeah, unbelievably funny, and that's understandable. But others, you just sort of think this is pointless, really. Why are we watching this completely fantasy that's pretending to be a documentary? And I never sort of attempted that. There was always a line between the drama and the documentary elements that existed, even though you might cross over it every now and again. So it was a different sort of experimentation, I think.
It was just interesting when you mentioned the terrorism, and I'm sure quite a few of the people who are listening can relate. I can remember, was it 78 that they had the Hilton bombing as part of
Yeah, well, I made a film about the Hilton bombing conspiracy, yeah.
Because I can just, they then, the leaders of the Commonwealth then came to Canberra for a weekend retreat. Yes. And I can remember we were, my wife and I were going somewhere, and you suddenly saw police or security underneath Commonwealth Bridge overpass. And
right. Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of that was the first time sort of became visible. And of course, now you go to a cricket match and you've got policemen walking around and policewomen walking around. I don't know how they walk. They have so many items of guns So that was interesting.
Yeah, well, there was a whole debate about the militarisation of the police and where the police should be responsible for counter-terrorism actions or whether it should be the military. And in the end, they decided that it would be the police, but they really militarised the police. So they just gave them everything that the military would have in effect.
Not quite as bad as in the US, but we're moving that way. I was in Melbourne the other day and I saw what would in the army be, an armed personnel carrier, but it was a police personnel carrier, which is,
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And of course, the arguments were about the two different ethoses. So in the military, the ethos is maximum force to achieve your aim. In the police, it's minimum force, use minimum force. And so once you start to militarise police, it's hard to continue with that police ethos of minimum force. But yes, it's a vexed question.
That's a good point. I hadn't sort. That's a. So Darryl, coming back to the film you made on Justice Murphy. So at this stage, you've mentioned Jenny a couple of times.
Yeah.
You were in a relationship at this stage from your
Yeah, we've been together since 1978, so it goes back quite a long way, since Monash days. And so we've sort of crisscrossed in our work. I made the film about Frank Hardy, and I was quite close to Frank, and I was working actually on developing a film of one of his books, Who Shot George Kirkland, when he died, which was a real tragedy. And it's terrible to know someone who's in the public eye like he was, and who dies, because I'd seen him and had a meeting with him, and a few days later, I'm walking past a milk barn. There's a big Herald Sun hoarding out the front, says Frank Hardy dead, and that's how I found out that he died, and it was really awful. But anyway, so I'd made this film and had connection to Frank. And so Jenny, of course, knew him, and then she decided she'd write a biography of him. But she didn't do that until after he died. So he was never involved with her biography. And then with the Murphy film, Jenny had actually written an article about Lionel Murphy that she called Mr. Neil's Entitled to Be an Agitator. And then we made the film after that, and she was involved in making the film. And I remember at the time, of Murphy's troubles, the media story was went one way. And we went to a conference in Lincoln, in London, in England, and met John Pilger there. And he said, I'm writing a book that has a chapter on Lionel Murphy. And his chapter on Lionel Murphy was how he was a corrupt Labor figure. And he heard Jenny give this paper, which was called Mr. Neil's Entitled to Be an Agitator, which is the beginnings of our film. And when he heard that, he came up to her after it, to his great credit, I think. And he said, he found her somewhere, and he said, I'm going to delete that chapter, because I didn't know any of this stuff that you've got. So the film was very powerful, I think. It had a very powerful effect, Mr. Neil, because people didn't know anything about that. They just knew the controversy in the media, corrupt judge, blah, blah, blah.
The AGO raid, almost.
Yeah, all that stuff. Anything that was controversial and a bit over the top, that was Lionel Murphy. And, so it wasn't hard to push that into corruption and criminality. But his life couldn't be further from that. No.
And who was funding these films, or who were you making them for?
Yeah, well, the first films I made were funded in different ways, but often the Australian Film Commission was involved. And then as we got later into the 1990s, the Australian Film Finance Corporation was created, and they funded the films as a part of an accord arrangement with the ABC. So just about all my films have screened on the ABC, and they've been funded by the federal government film funding agency in arrangement with the ABC.
We'll just come back at a later stage, just the work in between, but just, is it the same kind of environment for getting funding for films like that? It seems to me it's a much more political judgment now, and public servants sort of look above to see what might happen before they make a decision. Fricker at the archives may be a case in point, but I just, these films take one particular political view and slant. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it still that kind of environment, or is it a little bit more cautious nowadays?
Well, it probably started getting difficult in the 2000s, really. That's when you really start to find that there was not much appetite for making the sort of films that we've been making, documentaries, and the ABC has kind of, or the arrangement the ABC had, which was an accord with the film funding bodies, has sort of morphed into the opposite of what it was intended to do. So in the mid 1980s, when it was created, the accord was created because there were a lot of award-winning independent documentaries that were never screened on the ABC, and they'd go to festivals all around the world. The ABC wouldn't show them. And if you ask the ABC, why aren't you showing these films or even funding them, making them? They said, oh, if we wanted to make films like that, we'd make them ourselves. So they just wouldn't interact with a very vibrant, independent sector. So with the sort of pressure began to bear on them that they needed to deal with this independent sector of film, documentary film practice. And so the accord was established, and the idea was that the ABC would provide a license fee. They'd buy this independent production and they'd screen it so many times. And that license fee would actually help to make the film. So it wasn't a real return to the filmmakers, it went into the budget. And that's how the independent sector started to get their films screened on the ABC. But now what happens is it sort of turned around to what it used to be, in a sense, and that is a lot of the films that now screen on both the broadcasters, ABC and SBS, are really films that you'd describe more as network television. They're things that they've worked up, ideas they've worked up, and they might get independent filmmakers to make them, but they're not really independent filmmakers' project in that sense. I mean, there's variation, and there are independent films, of course, that get bought and screened, but largely you have this sense of kind of formula for making a certain sort of documentary, and so the ABC and SBS buy into that and they screen those films, and they don't really know what to do with something that's outside that. If it's outside the formula they have for what a documentary is, they kind of don't know what to do with it. So that's completely opposite of what the system was meant to be. It was meant to be that independent filmmakers develop their projects and the ABC or SBS then bought them.
And I suppose with the ABC, you see they do more investigation, say with the Nine Network. Maybe, you know, they end up on Four Corners or something like that. But yeah, but
well, they always did that though. That this sort of filmmaking I'm talking about doesn't really tread on their toes. They can do that sort of stuff as much as they like. I wouldn't call myself a journalist. You know, I don't do journalism really. I do documentary filmmaking, my own, and things that I'm interested in doing from a certain perspective. You know.
So then, given what you've just said, how did the Palace Letters then come to fruition?
Well,
and I suppose the question I was also going to ask, I mean, that was a lengthy period that you were filming, Jenny, and you had no idea what the outcome could be, and then obviously that would influence what was actually showable, depending on what the outcome would be. So yeah, and again, we sort of jumped to the future a bit, but be interested in your perspectives around that. Yeah, the Palace Letter, such a great documentary it was, Darryl.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was, firstly, I'd have to say to you, it was very, very difficult to make that film. It was a very tough ride, and by all accounts, really, it should never have been made, because the company and us, Sue and I, as producers, didn't make a cent out of it. We had to pay to have that film screened on the ABC. And that's not the way it's meant to work. And the main reason that happened was that Screen Australia didn't support us. They didn't think the film was worth making. They didn't think it was an interesting story. They didn't have any support for it whatsoever, and they slammed it. We applied to them 3 times, and all 3 times they just ditched it, said, no, this isn't interesting. We don't want to support this film. And at one point they even told me that there should be more of me in the film. This is a story about Jenny, right? Totally about her case, about what she did. And Screen Australia are telling me, you should be in more of it. You know, we should see more of you. I'm thinking, good God, these people living in the 19th century have to have a man tell us what's going on all the time. It's extraordinary. Anyway.
So Dan, just when was this? Was this the sort of mid 2015s, or was it a bit later?
No. I mean, Jenny had been struggling from then, but I didn't start trying to get money from Screen Australia to make the film until about 2021 or something like that. 22.
Had you been doing filming before that?
Yes, yeah. So I'd done
where it was going to end up, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But just on my own bat, I did filming without any support to speak of. So the funding bodies that really supported us were Vic Screen and, amazingly enough, Screen West in Western Australia, because my colleague, Ian Wansborough, lives in Perth. So his script editing was paid for by them, which was a fantastic thing. And they both, those government bodies really supported us very strongly, which was fantastic. But Screen Australia just was not interested. And so that killed the film, because without Screen Australia, they're the major investor in documentary film. And if you can't get them, you don't happen. So in this case, the ABC actually were very interested from the beginning, but their interest started to kind of wane as Screen Australia backed off. And once Screen Australia wasn't there, the ABC saw, well, there's nothing we can do. And in the end, the arrangement we had to finance the film was very unusual, and that was that the ABC actually bought it as an acquisition, and usually they don't pay very much for acquisitions at all. But in this case, they put up enough to cover the cost of the archival film we used. So it was a sort of in-house arrangement. We never actually exchanged any money, but they gave us the archive film, which there's quite a lot of. So the ABC really were instrumental. The film would never have been made without their assistance. And, there were a few hiccups along the way. They've got a body now at the ABC called Editorial and Policy, and they make a lot of judgments about your film. And usually they probably wouldn't be involved in an acquisition, but in this case, they had quite a lot to say, and we had to edit some things out of the film because of their, that they didn't want it there for some reason. And so it was a bit of a compromise. But I've never had that. So the last film I made for the ABC was in 2016. It was about Harry Seidler, the architect. And editorial and policy back then were just, here's a booklet. These are our guidelines. Stick with these. And that's about it. I never had any, I didn't have anybody sitting up there in Ultimo saying to me, you've got to take this scene out or take that bit of dialogue out or change this. Just never happened. So, obviously defamation is an issue, and we're very pleased to have the ABC's lawyers give their opinion on it, because you don't want to get into a situation of defamation. So I'm not complaining about that part. That's always been the case. But editorial and policy is a brave new world for me.
Who owns the film then?
Oh, we own it. Yeah, we totally own it. And they've paid a fee to screen it. That's a licensing fee to screen the film.
But you mentioned before you had to pay the ABC to have it screened.
What I mean by that is we had to put our own money in to finish the film effectively. Okay. So otherwise we couldn't finish it. And so we had a shortfall in our budget. That's the issue, really. So, in layman's terms, that means we're paying for it. The ABC gets to screen it, rather than them saying, all right, you've had you're bringing this film to us, we'll pay you what it's worth. In other words, to finish it, you need this extra money, we can do that. And so anyway, that sort of stems from the fact, I think, that Screen Australia didn't come on board in the way that we would have hoped. So Screen Australia, the money in the end that funded the film was out of Sue and I's pocket, some money from the ABC and the state funding bodies, and Screen Australia put money in, but under a scheme where they have no they have no input into the choice. It's just you tick boxes. If you have a film, yes, you've done this, you've done that, we'll fund it to a certain amount. And it wasn't enough for our budget, but it,
I think somebody I had a couple of years ago, I had sort of Quentin Dempster talk about the ABC.
Yes.
I have it also run a general forum. I must get somebody else, because to me the ABC just seems to be all over the shop. I grew up for 65 years watching the ABC, and it's a lot of its news services seem to be trying to play the commercial game. And
yes, I must say I
not what it
very
was.
much dislike their sort of the police rounds they seem to have every night on the ABC. Who needs to know that a woman in Keighley got stabbed or something, or all this sort of stuff? Every night they have this, and it seems to take up an inordinate amount of their time.
I wrote them a letter once in the ACT complaining that they didn't put the Aussie Rules football scores up.
Right.
And they said, "You're right, we didn't," but they said it in such bad grace. But anyway, that was just shows you my own personal interest. But
yeah, right. Fair enough.
Yes, I was also and just to reaffirm, the Jenny we're talking about for people is Jenny Hocking, the author of the Palace Letters. When I was talking to Jenny, I asked her, did she ever feel sort of personally aggrieved by David Fricke and wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, I'm going to blow his car up or something? Whereas I would have, and she said, no, she didn't feel like that, whereas I would have. But it must have been quite a tension-filled process the last couple of years of that whole court case, and different, sort of Turnbull going one way and then going back. And
yes. Oh yeah, look, it took its toll. It was an incredible thing, and I must say I felt a bit kind of shocked to hear Turnbull say when I interviewed him, "Oh, I just thought we'd let Jenny's case handle that, and that had come to the right decision." And I was thinking, oh my God, thanks a lot, because he could have stepped in at any time, of course, and just closed the whole thing down. But yeah, look, it was incredibly stressful. It was very interesting to find out as a sort of litigant what goes on in the federal court and how it works and all that sort of thing. But yes, I wouldn't advise anybody to do it.
Think twice.
What's that?
Think twice before you take that step.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe we'll move on to Justice Kirby. So you've done a documentary on Justice Kirby, but you've also written a book.
Yes,
you've written a number of books, but Justice Kirby, he's a big profile figure.
Yeah, so I met Michael years ago, actually, when I made the film about Lionel Murphy, and he agreed to be interviewed for that. And then sort of we kept in touch a bit, and when he got appointed to the High Court, I thought, oh, this could be a great opportunity to make a film that's about the High Court, but really is looking at Michael's appointment there and what he might do and all that sort of thing. And so I asked him about that, and he said, he would feel very uncomfortable about a film being made about him now that he's gone to the High Court. But why don't I ask the Chief Justice, who was Sir Gerard Brennan then, if he'd be interested in a film about the High Court? So I did. I went down that path, and Gerard Brennan was absolutely open to it. And I say that I achieved better than most QCs then, now KCs, because I got a 5-2 victory out of the High Court when I put a proposal to them for a film, a documentary on the High Court, and 5 of them agreed and 2 of them didn't agree. But they went along with the majority decision, which was good. And Michael McHugh was one of the ones that disagreed, and he's a great character in that film. So this is the film I made about the High Court. From the bench, he wouldn't be involved in being interviewed or anything like that, whereas the other 5 did. They all agreed to do an interview and be filmed, in their chambers and that sort of thing. So after I made that film, I thought I eventually got back to Michael again and said, how about a sort of biographical film about you? And he was happy about that then because he was about to retire. So the film is predicated on that it covers the period, the last period he's on the High Court, his retirement, and then leaving the court. And so it came out in 2010, I think. So he's a very unusual character, of course, and a very public one, and a very interesting character. So his life sort of cried out to be told, really, and I think many people had wanted to do it, but I was lucky enough to get the gig. So Michael, he's quite an interesting person in terms of his relationship to his family. I think his family's been very important to him, and I explored that a bit more in the book than in the documentary. But it was the first time that his partner Johan agreed to be interviewed, and he's a fantastic character in the film as well.
Just other people I mentioned to Darryl when we were talking before this, that my one meeting with Michael Kirby, I was the driver for the Canberra Writers Festival, and he was appearing, and I picked him up from the airport, and it was a Friday afternoon, and he nearly fell asleep in the car as I took him to the venue. But once, and it was with Natasha Stock, the spoiler. But once he got to the venue, what a trooper! He just sparked up, and then once the talk started, it was a great show. He was a great showman. He was a great showman. It was just flick a switch. In one question I've got, and I'll keep on going with Justice Kirby, though, is one person's asked, how can they access some of these films, Mr. Newton and so on?
Well, our company, filmartmedia.com, have the films available. You can either stream them on Vimeo. I think it's like $4 or something to stream it, or you can buy DVDs. They're all available on our website. So, yeah.
Okay, no, look, that's great.
And some of the streaming services have them already. Like there's one called Canopy that has our films on it. And yeah, there's a few. If you look around, you'll see they're already up there as well.
And I suppose in the filming and writing about Michael Kirby, I mean, the story goes that when he left, none of the other justices came to his farewell drinks. I mean, was that sort of apparent that I don't know if the word animosity is the right word, but that Michael was of a different nature to the other judges? Did that sort of come out?
I think it's probably the flip side of his personality, like you were describing, how he's so outgoing and he loves to be there and talk to people and have his opinions on things. And most judges, particularly High Court judges, just want to keep out of limelight totally, but it's not really in Michael's nature to do that. I think he only ever got into trouble once for speaking about something, a case that maybe had come before him and was before him or something. So it wasn't really, that wasn't the issue. The issue was about they didn't like somebody who was a kind of, as they would have seen it, a self-promoter. They're meant to be part of the court and that's it, and no one should be speaking out and that kind of thing. So the farewell, so he had a ceremonial farewell session in the court, which was, you know, really fantastic opportunity for people to go and see him sitting there for the last time. But justices aren't meant to do that. That's only for the Chief Justice to have, as far as I understand. So I think that put their noses out of joint. There's no reason why you can't do it, but it's just, you know, they're very much sticklers for precedent and all the rest of it. So now Michael's done that. Maybe there's been many more. I don't know. I haven't followed that side of it, but so they wouldn't have liked that. So that might have accounted for their non-attendance. But I think Michael did feel enormously sad, and that he wasn't embraced on the High Court by the other judges in the way that he was when he was president of the New South Wales Court of Appeal. So when he was president of the Court of Appeal, he was very much a leader of that court, and you know, there was a sense that the other judges really respected him and acknowledged what he was doing in that job. But he didn't get that on the High Court so much.
Yeah. Okay. And then from your perspective, the creative process of writing a book and filming a documentary are quite different. How do you find that? I would have thought possibly writing a book was a bit more frustrating than doing the filming, but
well, that's interesting, because I found the opposite.
Well, I don't know. I'm asking you.
Because the book, you could sit down and just do it, and you didn't have any sort of roadblocks to that. Whereas filmmaking is a shocking process of always hoping that you're going to get the last dollar you need in your budget, but never knowing whether you really are, and never knowing whether the project's going to happen or not, and spending a lot of time and work on something that may never ever see the light of day. That's just par for the course. That's filmmaking in Australia. Whereas writing a book, assuming you have a contract with a publisher, I just found that a breeze. I just sat down, I wrote it, and I didn't have any of those sorts of problems, you know, which can be incredibly demoralising. So that's nothing about the quality of the book, but in terms of my relationship to the writing of it, I found it was much easier than filmmaking.
Okay. And then, you know, you've done some recent films and written a book on Utzon and the Opera House, and also Harry Seidler. So do you have a sort of an interest in architecture as well?
Yeah, I have. I've always had an interest in architecture, going back to when I first did visual arts. And when I made the film about Jørn Utzon and the Sydney Opera House, it was partly inspired by the architecture, but it was also because of the incredible story of the making of that building, and Utzon's involvement. So my film, The Edge of the Possible, is about Utzon's work. So it starts in mid-1950s when he found out about the competition and ended it, and it goes through to when he left in 1966. So it's about his involvement. It's not about the architects that came in afterwards or what happened with the building afterwards. And that story of his involvement is so extraordinary. That's what really enthralled me to make that film. And then we never imagined we'd be able to interview Utzon, because he was a recluse. He hadn't spoken to an Australian journalist for like 25 years. He did an interview with Peter Luck in about 1974 or something. It was the last time he ever spoke to an Australian journalist about it. And he'd done some things with Danish filmmakers, but nothing in English. So we never imagined we'd speak to him. But we'd been working very closely with one of his lieutenants, a man named Mogens Britbus. He was Danish, and he'd worked on the Opera House with Utzon in a very close capacity. And Mogens was feeding information back to Utzon all the time and telling him what we were up to. And so when we got to Denmark to film, we got a call and they said, oh, the hotel manager told us you've got a phone call. It's from the maestro. And it was Utzon, and he wanted us to come and see him. So that's how that happened. And we filmed him, and yeah, it was a wonderful thing to do. It was incredible to meet him over those few days.
He didn't appear embittered by the process.
No, he said he's not. He said he wasn't bitter, but he was definitely damaged by it in all sorts of ways. I didn't realise until quite recently that one of the ways that Utzon was damaged was that the New South Wales government refused to give him a reference. And that really ruined his career after that. So in Denmark, I had no idea of this. In Denmark, he never got a commission for a public building, and the Architecture of Association of Denmark basically blacklisted him, scolded him for what they said. You never leave a project if you're an architect. You should never have left that one. That's and amazing. So he was really damaged by what happened in Sydney, and it was only in 2011 I went to Copenhagen, and they had a conference that was celebrating Jørn Utzon, the Danish architecture people were doing that. And that's the first time they'd ever done anything like that and recognised him in that way. And of course, that was after his death. And so he found it very hard to get major projects. In fact, the major project that he did get after the Opera House, which is an extraordinary building, was the Kuwaiti Parliament building. And in a strange kind of tragedy, both his major monumental works, the Sydney Opera House and the Kuwaiti Parliament building, do not have his interiors. Because of the Sydney Opera House, he was removed, as you know, and the interiors were done by a separate group of architects. And in the Kuwaiti Parliament, he did do the interiors. He completely finished the building. But in the war, Saddam Hussein destroyed the interior of the building, and the Kuwaitis came back and rebuilt the interior in late 20th century dictator style. And they, Arabic, they had chandeliers and all this stuff. That was never a conception of what Utzon had. So it's a real tragedy. So that building now exists as an external building of Utzon's, and that is incredible. It looks like a Bedouin tent with this huge waveform. And the Sydney Opera House exists as an exterior of his work, but neither of them have the interiors.
No, the Museum of Modern Art in Central Park in New York, I visited there, and what really blew me away was they had the Frank Lloyd Wright. They'd demolished the house, but they'd kept the room. And it was all designed by him, every bit, even to the cushions.
Yes.
And that's what you saw. Such an impressive museum. Look, there's a question here from Ray.
Yes.
Ray, can you say anything more about that original course at Monash? Who conducted the course? At
Monash, yeah. Well, visual arts was the inaugural professor, as I said, was Patrick McCaughey, who went on to be the director of the National Gallery of Victoria and many other esteemed things. And there was two people who probably were the most influential on me in the film studies course, which was part of visual arts. And that was a man named David Hannon and an American sort of rather flamboyant character who came out from UCLA or somewhere called James Roy McBean, who wrote a book called Film and Revolution, which was mainly about Godard, the work of Jean-Luc Godard and others, I think. So he and David Hannon, they had a big effect on me in that course. Patrick didn't have so much to do with, he gave the lectures on the art history of art and so on. And they were great lectures. He was an incredible lecturer, and he had a real charisma about him. And his lectures were very fascinating. But he didn't do the film course, which was the thing I mean, I really enjoyed visual arts generally, but the film course was the thing that I got the most out of, I think. It's the most exciting for me.
We're sort of getting to 11 o'clock, if we maybe can steal a couple of minutes. But just on that point, I mean, when you look back over your career, Darryl, who would you say, or what has been the biggest influence on the direction you've taken? Parents, teachers, Jenny?
Well, all of those, of course. And Jenny and I have worked very closely on lots of projects together, backwards and forwards. Either I've made a film and she's written a book, or articles, or vice versa. So, yeah, that has been very important. And also, I would say the 2 film courses that I did. So there where you are in Canberra at what was then the CAE, that course was very influential, because that's where I met 2 people I worked with for the rest of my career. But also the course itself was a great course. It was very intensive, but it was fascinating, and it really, something that I will remember very fondly, that course. And then, of course, Swinburne. The year I did a film at Swinburne was also very important, both as a filmmaker, because I had an opportunity to make a film, and that's what they gave you there. So that was really great. But it's very hard to pick one thing. But I think they're probably the most important people, and the people I work with still, and Jenny, and those courses were probably the most influential things.
Two final questions. You got involved with the Dressmaker.
Yes, yeah.
How did that come about? Your role there for, I suppose, commercial film rather than a documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was Sue Maslin's passion, and so she was always doing that, working on and then getting the budget for that secured. And making feature films is even more difficult than making documentaries. There are so many hurdles, and it's all about putting together all the elements that you need. And if any single one drops out for some reason, the actress doesn't agree to do it, or the script doesn't quite work, or a small parcel of money that you are hoping to get in a budget of 20 million or something doesn't come through, then the whole thing falls over. You've got to get every single duck lined up, And so I watched Sue doing that for so long, and we, as business partners running Film Art Media, she was putting the film through Film Art Media. So I was very much involved in the development and, reading the scripts and all that sort of thing. And then had a credit as executive producer on that film. So it's been a kind of more of a business relationship, really, the making of that feature film.
Okay, final question, trick question for you, Darryl. How did you find Canberra in 1978?
Well, I didn't come in 78. I came in 82.
Sorry, okay, 82. Yeah. How did you find Canberra in 82?
I found it was great for what I was doing. So I found it to be a sort of place where if you were really working hard on something and intensively, whether it was, education or whatever, as I was, that it was wonderful for that. It's a very easy place to live in, and it worked fantastically. But I came, in February or March, and I left in October. I didn't, and probably spent quite a bit of time going to Sydney on weekends and things like that during the year. But no, I really enjoyed my time in Canberra. So, but I'm not sure that I could live there permanently.
It's changed. But I was at the Uni of Canberra yesterday. The old CCA.
Yes.
It looks fantastic. I think it was always sort of second to the ANU, but it's a strong university in its own own right now.
Yeah, I remember being there really fondly. I had a great time in Canberra.
Yeah. Well, look, Darryl, it's been fantastic. I think it's gone in different areas than I thought it would, and we've covered, I think, a lot of the filmmaking and sort of the changing scene for getting films made here. The government it's been great. I think. Thank you for being so candid. Thank you for providing so much time. I've personally found it a really very enlightening and insightful presentation. So thank you, Darryl.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. So I hope it's been of interest.
Yeah, and I just haven't mentioned Darryl follows North Melbourne Football Club, so he's got a bit of pain there for a few years yet, Darryl, whereas us Carlton supporters, we've had our pain. Glory beckons.
Right. Well, I came to North Melbourne about 1996, so I've had
Good year.
I had all that.
Yeah.
All the ups. The last thing I remember, though, was leaving the MCG with a crowd of Adelaide supporters singing whatever their song is, which wasn't great. That was the 98 grand final or something.
Well, I saw the 99, so you had it. That was a good year for North. That was a good
99,
year.
I saw in a bar in Paris at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
That was very good.
Okay then, Darryl, thank you very much. Oh, and I just might say, what we do, just as a token of our thanks, we make a donation to a charity that is of the mental health of young people. They've started in Newcastle. They've opened a facility here in Canberra, and it's actually books and films that as a counterbalance for whatever might be impacting these young people. So we will make a donation on your behalf as a token of our appreciation.
Oh, that's lovely. That's fantastic. I'm so glad. Thank you.
And thank you very much again, Darryl. Have a great day.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks, Alex. Bye.
Thanks everybody else for coming in. Thank you.